The flags are at half-staff tonight here in the nation's capital and across the country. And this is why. The picture is now etched in our minds, but still horrifying. The disastrous end of the 25th Shuttle mission. The sudden death of 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, including the first teacher in space. Americans once again reaching for the stars, and this time, the first time, not making it. That is why the nation's flags are at half-staff tonight.
This is an ABC News special. The Shuttle, Disaster in Space. Reporting from Washington, here is Peter Jennings.
What we're going to try to do in the next hour is to put this national tragedy in some sort of context. The nation has lost 7 explorers. Ever since the manned space program began a quarter of a century ago with people like Alan Shepard and John Glenn, the astronauts, in one way or another, have seemed to belong to the nation. We do not know exactly what happened up there, 10 miles above Cape Canaveral this morning, but we will talk to other astronauts about what might have gone wrong. We certainly know what happened here on Earth. The shock and the sorrow has been truly international in scope. And so we'll talk, besides to just plain folks, to politicians, including Senator Jake Garn, who's been on the shuttle, and to James Michener, who so effectively captured the space program in his book. But we're going to begin with those who, to say it again, we have all lost. Here's ABC Stone Phillips.
They were America's crew, men and women, veterans and first-timers, parents and even a classical pianist. They came from Akron and Detroit, Boston and the Carolinas. They were pilots and engineers and a teacher, and they were young. The oldest would have turned 47 in May. What they shared was a pioneer spirit, a passion for adventure, and a belief that man's discoveries in space can help solve problems on Earth. Their leader was Commander Dick Scobie, age 46, making his second journey into space. He became an astronaut in 1979 after 22 years in the Air Force. He saw combat duty in Vietnam, won the Flying Cross and Distinguished Air Medal, and later, as a test pilot, logged more than 5,300 hours in dozens of experimental aircraft. Born and raised in Washington State, Scobie is survived by his wife June and 2 children. A few months ago, he returned to his high school to share his enthusiasm for space.
He really wanted to interact with the kids. It was okay to talk to the adults, but his whole purpose of coming back was to deal with the kids and maybe give them some sort of a message or a goal.
Second in command was pilot Michael Smith, a 40-year-old commander in the U.S. Navy on his first shuttle mission. Like Scobie, he had served as a pilot in Vietnam, been decorated, and gone on to train as a test pilot. He was selected as an astronaut in 1980. He was married and the father of 3, and close to Senator and former astronaut Jake Garn.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident.
39-year-old Ellison Onizuka was Hawaii's first astronaut. His hometown honored him with a traditional parade before he left for astronaut training. Onizuka was also a husband and father, seen here with his 2 girls. Before turning astronaut, he taught at the elite Air Force Test Pilot School in California, and as chief of engineering there, was responsible for all instrumental and flight testing modifications on highly experimental jet aircraft. For Onizuka, a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, the exploration of space was a way to serve man's more immediate needs.
There are a lot of outcomes from these projects which will affect both our society and the rest of the world.
36-year-old Judy Resnick from Akron was on her second mission. Her specialty, electrical engineering, her assignment to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm. On her first mission, she used the device successfully to help remove ice from the outside of the orbiter. It was also on that mission in 1984 when the shuttle Discovery aborted takeoff moments after the engines had been fired. Resnick later expressed confidence in the shuttle's safety systems.
After it all happened, we were all very grateful that the safety features do what they're supposed to do, on the orbiter, and I think that the system has been designed such that anything that could present a problem will be taken care of by these safety features.
When Resnick wasn't flying, she sometimes doubled as a commentator, helping bring to life for television viewers what it was like to take off on board the shuttle. Gregory Jarvis, age 41, was a Hughes aircraft engineer on board Challenger to conduct tests on the effect of weightlessness on liquids carried in tanks. NASA hoped his experiments would provide information for the design of liquid fuel rockets. He was born in Detroit and trained as an Air Force satellite engineer. He was married but had no children. Mission specialist Ronald McNair was doing research on lasers when he was selected to become an astronaut in 1978. Born in Lake City, South Carolina, schooled at MIT, he brought a background in physics to the shuttle program. This was his second flight. A husband and father, McNair saw space travel as a calling for himself and mankind.
So I see it as something that we must do, and I see it as something that's part of man's nature to explore.
And finally, the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, chosen from more than 11,000 applicants for what she described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Well, it was a challenge, and it was something that I always asked my students, you know, to go and seek whatever they feel they can do and reach a little higher.
McAuliffe taught social studies in Concord, New Hampshire, and she said she wanted to bring the wonder of space to students all across the country. She'd planned to give lessons on weightlessness and life in outer space that were to be televised to millions of schoolrooms. She's survived by her husband, her 2 children, and all the students she taught and adored in Concord.
She did this to get people into the space program, you know, to open up people's eyes and get people more enthusiastic about it. And I know that she will hope that people take this as a bad accident, as bad accidents do occur, and just do have faith.
In the end, faith is what America's space program began and grew up with, that and technology. Today, whatever it was that went wrong, it wasn't a problem of faith. Stone Phillips, ABC News.
The 7 men and women who flew on Challenger this morning, in some cases having flown before, and reminding us, of course, that the success of the space program has been such over the last few years. This was the 10th mission of Challenger and the 25th of the shuttle program, that we have come to take its success and its safety very much for granted until today. I suppose the reminder there is that we now identify with those men and women in a much more personal way than we have done almost at any point since the beginning of the space shuttle program, with the exception of a woman flying for the first time, or in the case of the first black astronaut in space. You saw in Stone Phillips' report Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who said that today's accident was so devastating to him it was clear. Senator Garn is now at Andrews Air Force Base, having just got off the Vice President's aircraft, having flown to Cape Canaveral to talk to the people at Launch Control and clearly to talk to the families. Senator Garn, I think I know what the mood and the atmosphere was that you found down there, but would you tell us anyway?
Well, obviously it was very difficult. You always feel so inadequate. What do you say to people when they have lost their loved ones, and particularly where I was so personally involved and knew those that were killed today. But I was so impressed with Mrs. Scobie. She stood up and she said, "We want you to know, Mr. Vice President and Senators, and I'm sure I speak for all of the families, that we want the space program to go on. We don't want this tragic accident to slow it down or stop it." And she said, "We know that our loved ones would feel the same way." And so it was just a very moving and touching experience.
Senator, you flew on the shuttle last April. You're an enormous supporter and very much a booster of the space program. What do you think today will do to America's program in space?
Well, obviously we can't fly again until we determine the cause of this tragic accident. But once that has been determined, we make certain that it can't happen again, then the space program should continue. We have learned so much from space. It benefits all of God's children, every place on this earth. The basic research and development that goes on is so valuable to us, and that must continue. And I think we need to look at the fact that we flew 56 manned space missions, a remarkable safety record for this tragic accident today. So I hope that my colleagues will be smart enough to recognize the values of space flight, listen to Mrs. Scobie, and have the space program continue.
Senator, we have been thinking today about why this has been such a shock to the nation. Why do you think?
Probably because the space program has been so successful. John Glenn was with me today, and from his very first orbital flight, we have not lost a single American in space. And that is a remarkable record, and I suppose too many people have taken it for granted. They haven't realized that we are still in the infancy of space flight, that we still have a great deal further to go, just as in the beginning of general aviation after the Wright brothers. And so I guess they just expected never to have an accident. We just continue going on with our magnificent success record.
And Senator, there has been today the inevitable mini debate, I think we can say, about the value of man in space versus the value of sheer technology in space. Why should man go into space so constantly?
Why should man have explored the West? Why should the man have crossed oceans? There is a balance that we need in space. We have the Uranus mission out. We've done a lot of unmanned space programs. But you look at what man has been able to accomplish. You look at the work that has been done in space. You look at the experimentation on medicines for the future. You look at the repair, the retrieval of satellites in space. Man can do a great deal that machines can't do, and so you need a balance of the two. And we have had that, and that balance should continue, using robotics and using man.
Senator, I know this has been an extremely difficult day for you. I do have one last question. We were immensely frustrated waiting for NASA's briefing today and getting as little as we did. Do you think NASA will reach some kind of conclusion fairly quickly based on the data they have?
I would not expect a quick conclusion to this. There is so much information. There are hundreds of channels of telemetering data that comes back that has to be analyzed. They'll have to appoint a commission to study this. And I don't think they want any quick fixes. They want to know what happened and why and how to fix it. And that is the important thing, not speed in making that determination, but make sure we make a sound determination and sound recommendations.
Senator, you're very thoughtful to take the time for us when you've given so much time to the families today, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator Jake Garn, senator from Utah, who flew on the shuttle last April, and who, as we said, and as you can clearly see, is an enormous booster of the continuation of the American manned space program. The senator raises the question of safety and delay. Back in 1967, when the astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee died when their spacecraft caught fire on the ground, it took 22 months before the space program was resumed, which will give you some indication of how long we might now have to wait before the manned space program, the shuttle program, continues. Challenger today had flown for just a little over a minute. When it left Cape Canaveral after something of a delay, it was a little after 11:30 in the morning. Let us go back now to recall that moment which much of the nation saw live and much of the nation shared in. The initial joy and the subsequent horror.
Space shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger.
As you can see on your screens there, it was 11:39 in the morning Eastern Standard Time after yet another delay, and Challenger's had a number of them, as has had Columbia. But it looked so perfect against the blue Atlantic sky as the rollover came.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%.
And those big additional booster rockets in the main engine rocketed Challenger towards its orbit,
65% shortly.
roughly approaching 2,000 miles an hour.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells.
There will be a phrase here that we shall all long remember. Listen to Mission Control, tell them what to do.
257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Go with throttle up. And then it happens.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And it occurred with such lightning speed as one of the booster rockets flies randomly off into space, and we look at it again in slow motion, that you may have noticed that the control commander, the launch control voice that we've become so familiar with on launches, was simply reading his telemetry, his information coming back and was not aware, as so many people were when they saw it, even though they didn't understand it in space. Lynn Scher, who covers space for us on a full-time basis. Lynn, can you pick up from your base in California and tell us now what we're seeing?
Well, Peter, we've just gotten past, obviously, the critical moment. This is the fireball. This is the catastrophic explosion engulfing the Challenger and the solid rockets. And I think in just a moment, you will see what we think there on the lower right of your screen appears to be Challenger's nose emerging from that big cloud, then falling into the ocean, our last view of Challenger. We have examined these tapes so many times, Peter, that we think we can at least try to pinpoint the sequence. At the right of your screen now, the solid rocket booster fizzling off into nowhere. Nowhere to go. It is controlled before launch, and it's meant, of course, to be attached to the shuttle and to the tank and to take them into orbit. But with that premature explosion, it has nowhere to go, and it's off into the ocean. And if I'm not mistaken, the next few frames will show us the crazy spinning of the two solid rocket boosters forming kind of an awkward Y-shaped as they each go off in kind of a cockeyed direction, obviously not where they're meant to be going at all. It looked to us when we have screened this tape before that the first flame appeared in between the external tank and the orbiter. Now that's the plume on the left. That's a little bit of the gas fuel for the fire, just the liquid hydrogen and oxygen burning off. There is where we thought we saw the first sign of flame. Actually, I think it was a little bit before this. Maybe we can go back and find that. In any event, this is the flame that is now going to ride up the external tank in between the tank and the orbiter, both of them extremely thin-skinned on purpose for weight reasons. They're not meant to withstand this kind of explosion, and obviously when that liquid hydrogen and oxygen gets near that kind of heat, boom, it just went in an instant. And no one I have talked to here on Earth believes that it happened in any more time than just an instant. The astronauts, the shuttle, simply did not have a chance. And in other words, to not put too fine a point on it, they didn't know it hit them. Absolutely not. I know that you and everybody were talking very hopefully for a while that perhaps those parachutes indicated they had gotten out. There really does not appear to be any way. That shuttle is simply not designed for that kind of explosion. Now, of course, the problem is what really happened. We can look at the sequence. We can pinpoint where we see the flames. What NASA has to do is figure out why. Peter, we've been talking to a number of people. There are a number of theories, all of them speculation. Let me run down a few of them for you, if I may. One possibility, perhaps one of the three main engines simply let go, causing a problem that way. These engines had flown before, all three of them, one of them on 3 missions, one of them on 4 missions, the other on 4 missions. Perhaps something happened to an engine. Another possibility, perhaps there was a problem in the fuel line connecting the tank to the shuttle Challenger. Maybe something happened there. Another problem, perhaps it was one of the struts, one of the connectors holding that big tank onto the shuttle. Maybe that was the problem. Another possibility, a puncture in the tank. That tank, again, extremely thin-skinned, the orange tank. Maybe there was a hole, maybe there was a leak, who knows. The only other possibility, and I'm sure there are millions more, the only other possibility I've heard discussed was that one of those boosters, one of those white crayon-like structures on the side, those big Roman candles, perhaps went awry before it split off. Our evidence from the footage we've seen does not seem to indicate that. Again, we're not going to know until they do all the analysis. Well, Lynn, those are, again, just some of the theories. Well, I'm just saying, just by suggesting some of the theories, you've opened an endless range of possibilities. One of the people who's been tremendously helpful to us today joins us again now from Houston, Gene Cernan, the former Apollo astronaut, the last man to walk on the moon. Gene, you've seen these same tapes over and over again today. What do they tell you?
Well, Peter, you know, we can speculate, I guess, all day long, but it does appear that something, Lynn's ideas are certainly have potential, but it appears to me that whatever it was, it violated the integrity of that tank and allowed the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen in some capacity to mix. And hydrogen is a tremendous explosive, and in this case, we saw the results of what can happen when it's mixed with something like oxygen. Well, Gene, let me offer, if I may, to you another theory, if I could get a look at this model here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but about a year ago, the whole process was lightened up to some extent.
And there was some suggestion today, at least by some people, that these struts, and Lynn has alluded to it, these things which basically hold the Challenger on to this enormous gas tank, which is really what it is, may have not been able to stand the stress. Do you buy that theory at all?
Well, of course, that's always possible, but you know, the vehicle was designed to go through that area we've talked so much about today called maximum dynamic pressure. That's when, if you will, the speed of the aircraft and the density of the air create the greatest wind on the spacecraft during its ascent. It's designed specifically as for that point being a high stress point, where you get the greatest shaking, the greatest bending of the skins, the greatest flapping of the wings, if you want to go to exaggeration. That's a very critical point. It appears that this either occurred just subsequent to that point. There may have been a rupture as a result of that through fatigue or for some other reason.
Gene, there has been the obvious question asked today about an escape mechanism in a space capsule or something on board the shuttle. There was one on Columbia some time ago. Why not on Challenger?
Well, you know, the Columbia's first 4 flights, I think the crew, it was only a 2-man crew. They did have ejection seats. It was a test vehicle. If we go in the history of the space program, no other manned spacecraft has been flown for the first time with a man aboard. They were all flown unmanned until we got to the space shuttle. We built ejection seats in so that the crew was able to make some decisions at different points of the missions had they needed to, had they had some inkling of a problem that was forthcoming. We decided when we put 5 and 6 and 7 people on and the shuttle became more operational, proved its capability, its reliability, that not only was there no need for those ejection seats, in a case like this, for instance, they would not have even done any good. There was an escape mechanism, and that was the shuttle itself. If the crew, if the ground had some idea that there was a problem occurring, a critical problem, even a couple moments ahead of time, they could have jettisoned that external tank, jettisoned those solid rockets, and although the maneuver is very complicated and difficult, landed back at Kennedy Space Center.
Gene, I'd like to point out, and I know that you know this too, of course they have that capability. As you well know, nobody really ever wanted to try that. A return to the launch site abort, which is the technical name for it, that emergency landing back at the Cape, they say they were prepared for it. They didn't really ever want to try it. And just to add to what you were saying about the ejection seats, Peter, you're quite right. There were ejection seats on Columbia. There are no longer. It has been modified to match Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis. And as Gene points out, there were only 2 ejection seats, and now there's 5, 6, and 7 passengers.
Well, I think the point I'm trying to get at here, because it has been raised today, and let me get a fairly brief answer from you, if I may, Gene. Was this a shortcut because we were putting additional personnel on the shuttle, or is this a reflection of how good NASA felt about the safety of the program in general?
No, the program was designed to follow this plan of attack. It was designed as a test article and a test vehicle initially to have those ejection seats. Subsequent to that, it was designed not to have them, and that was the plan. This was not a shortcut. It was just a planned and a long-term operation of this vehicle. You know, if I might refer to something Lynn said, she's absolutely right. Nobody ever wanted to make that abort and come back to landing site. A very difficult maneuver for the best aviator in the world. But we confronted those things a lot in the past. My last launch was a night launch. If everything failed and we had to abort during the same phase of the mission and we had to get off the launch vehicle, at nighttime I had to use STAR to be able to orient the vehicle so that we could head in the right direction and not burn up coming into the atmosphere. That's something I didn't want to do, but it's something we practiced, and I think indeed I knew we could do it if we had to, and I believe that was the same in this particular case in every shuttle flight.
Gene, thank you very much for joining us. You've made a wonderful contribution today, and we're very grateful. It helped our understanding a lot. Gene Cernan, last man to set foot on the moon, one of the Apollo astronauts who has become, as we said at the beginning of this program, the nation's astronaut, one of those individuals who has been so touched. One of the things that people have said fairly regularly today is that we've become rather blasé about the success of the manned space program. On the other hand, people have tended to refer on more than one occasion to the way people chivied away at NASA because both Columbia and Challenger have spent additional time on the ground when they were supposed to be launched because of minor and sometimes not so minor problems. There's no question that both Columbia and Challenger's the issue here today, was something of a troubled spacecraft. Does not suggest by any means reflection on what happened today, but it was, on occasion, a troubled spacecraft. Here's John McWethy.
When they built this $1.5 billion spacecraft, they projected that it would be flying for at least a decade, part of a fleet of space shuttles that would be roaring into orbit every few weeks. Challenger was on its 10th flight today and just its 3rd year of service. Like its sister ships, Columbia, Discovery, and Atlantis, Challenger has suffered through some crippling technical problems over the years, but has also repeatedly written itself into the history books with its many successful firsts. It was aboard Challenger that Sally Ride, the first female astronaut, made her maiden voyage into space. Guyan Bluford became the first American black in space. His ship was Challenger. The spacecraft was used for the first space walk from a shuttle in 1983, and a year later it proved for the first time that Shuttle could indeed capture a satellite, repair it, and send it back into orbit. But Challenger has also been shadowed by problems. Its first launch in 1983 was delayed for 2.5 months because of an engine leak. In one 1984 mission, the Challenger crew lost 3 satellites while trying to launch them into orbit. Malfunctions later blamed on the satellites, not on Challenger. In December of 1984, NASA had to scrub Challenger's next mission. It was supposed to carry the military's first secret payload into space. Challenger's protective heat shield had been badly damaged, and the ship had to go in for an extensive overhaul. Last July was probably Challenger's worst month until today. 3 seconds before its scheduled liftoff, the countdown was stopped because of a coolant leak.
We have an RSLS abort. We have an abort.
Later that same month, Challenger came perilously close to disaster when it suffered what NASA called a launch emergency. One of its engines shut down while the spacecraft was climbing into orbit. The crew scrambled to jettison excess weight, but they could never get Challenger up to its full orbit. Challenger was supposed to fly 5 missions this year. One of them was to be a secret military payload, taking it into orbit. The military, in fact, has been so concerned about the reliability of Challenger that it has insisted that NASA fly at least 2 military payloads a year the old-fashioned way atop expendable rockets. That was a hedge in case the Challenger and all of the other space shuttles proved that they could not do as promised. Peter?
John, thank you very much for joining us. In fact, on the 4 shuttles, there were 15 missions planned for 1986, both in the commercial field and the military field. This was to be a very ambitious year for the space shuttle. And as John McCarthy points out, and as others have pointed out, this is an enormous setback, not only for the commercial competition, but also for the military program, which the United States had been using the shuttle for. In a sense, we'd like to put aside for a moment now the technical dilemmas for today of Challenger in this particular instance and the overall program, and talk about the human dimension, because as those of you all around the country must have felt, and we have been quite stunned, I must tell you, to hear and feel and sense the reaction from all around the world. It came from China, it came from the Soviet Union, Her Majesty the Queen in Britain, the National Parliament in Canada took a minute of silence. There was this quite incredible outpouring of sorrow and shock from around the world for the 7 individuals on board. To talk about them a little this evening, we've invited James Michener, the author, to come onto the program from Austin, Texas, because his book, to a great many Americans, captured the feeling and the sense of the people in the space program. Mr. Michener, thank you for joining us. Talk to us a little bit, if you would, about the people in the space program.
I received some criticism in my novel Space because the great effort that I focus on at the end ends in tragedy. It aborts on the moon, the 2 great heroes are left there, and one man is left with the sad job of bringing the ship back home. People said, why did you have to do that? Well, I had to do it because any man with common sense, looking at this great program of which I had been a part for many years, knew that the capacity for what happened today was always there. It could always have happened. As a matter of fact, it did happen right at the beginning with those 3 wonderful young men, Grissom, White, and Chaffee. But the program went on. It was only 2 years after Chaffee and his friends died in that tragic accident that men were walking on the moon. And I think that's the lesson of today, that we have lost 7 wonderful people, one of whom was a good friend of mine. This has hit me with terrible force, but only as an example of what we live with in almost everything we do. The capacity for tragedy is always there, right at the edge.
And the danger, of course, is always there for people who live on the edge. The people we've talked to today, Mr. Michener, have often been very closely identified in a professional way with the space program. Through your research, I know you've spent a great deal of time with these people. What is it about them that leads the rest of us to invest so much in them and often place so much of a burden on them as national heroes?
I think with great affection of many of the astronauts I've known, and I'd like to make one point clear tonight. I've talked with them for many hours, and I have never heard the word fear mentioned. They don't sit around and brood about what would happen if I get into this crate and something happens. They know what would happen. It's part of their lives. They've accepted that 15 years ago when they wanted to become a test pilot or wanted to become an astronaut. They live with fear constantly, but they do not let it dominate their lives. I have never heard an astronaut speak of fear, nor would I ever speak of fear to them. We were talking about machines. We were talking about procedures. We were talking about the inevitable chances that all men take. Theirs were more grievous, I think, than some. But these were young men, and I knew two of the women very well and loved them, really. They were just magnificent people. And we talked about the professional problems. We talked about the next flight. Always there was the knowledge that this was a very difficult profession they had gone into. There was a dignity about it. There was a wonder. There was a feeling that they were on the cutting edge of life, and they wouldn't have been anywhere else.
Mr. Michener, I detect, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that what you're saying in favor of the manned space program as opposed to the purely technological one as we've seen in Voyager 2 out in the heavens this week is the question of judgment and touch. Is that right?
If you read the latter part of my book, Space, you will see that I pay a great deal of attention to that great debate between manned and unmanned space effort. I personally came down in the book slightly in favor of the unmanned, of sending the great machines out to see what they could do, just as yesterday the machine at Uranus sent us back such a remarkable bit of information. However, I knew from the beginning that in the United States, the space program had to have men and women in it to focalize what we were doing, to epitomize what the space program meant for human beings. And so I subdued my scientific bent and said, okay, if we have to do it with men more than perhaps we should, that's the rules of this game. And I was willing to live with it. Tonight, I think you phrase it very well, Peter. I'm absolutely 50-50. I see the virtues of each. I think each is necessary, and I expect to see each move forward with great triumphs for the rest of this century.
Mr. Michener, thank you very much for joining us this evening from Austin, Texas, and making such, as always, a thoughtful contribution. James Michener, the author in Austin, Texas, making the point so many people have made today. It's one of the reasons we fly the flag at half-staff all over the nation. Here in the Capitol tonight, at the White House, and in small and large communities all over the country. Because the adventure in space without man and without Americans is clearly incompatible with the national character. When we come back, we'll talk again to one of those astronauts, Deke Slayton. We'll also have some thoughts from George Will. We'll be back in just a moment.
ABC News coverage of the Shuttle disaster in space continues in a moment. After this message from your local stations.
Try to give you some indication of how the news today hit Washington like a thunderbolt. A number of us, reporters, were at the White House this morning waiting to see President Reagan, who usually on the morning of a State of the Union address calls in reporters from around the country, the networks and the newspapers and the wire services, to talk about his State of the Union message. And in the middle of that meeting, as we waited for the President to come into the dining room, a message was handed in the door to Don Regan, the Chief of Staff, saying, the shuttle has exploded, details to follow. We all fled from the room, obviously. And shortly thereafter, as some of you may know, the President canceled, postponed his State of the Union message, which will now be given a week from today. And the White House and Congress, but the White House particularly, has just felt the burden of this national tragedy very deeply. Here's our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
The flags went down to half-staff all over Washington as the shock set in, from the White House to Capitol Hill.
This is truly a national loss.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends.
The House of Representatives paused for a moment of silent prayer, and elected officials tried to make sense of what had happened.
I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no.
God moves in mysterious ways, I guess from time to time to remind us of what mortal beings we really are, and that everything isn't all that sure.
The Washington day began on a note of pleasant expectation. The President